and the WNHA is pleased to introduce a new feature that we hope to incorporate in all our future works, and that is Author's Corner. This is where an author in the naval history literature can be able to talk about his latest works or the work that goes into producing his body of work. And our inaugural member of the Author's Corner fraternity is none other than Professor Thomas Heinrich, who teaches at Banuch College City, University of New York. And he is the author of Ships for the Seven Seas, Philadelphia Shipbuilding in the Age of Industrial Capitalism, as well as his latest here, Warship Builders, an Industrial History of U.S. Naval Shipbuilding. And so we'd like to welcome Professor Heinrich here and invite him to talk about his work. Professor Heinrich.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. And thank you for having me. This is really warmly appreciated. Before I forget this, I do want to point out that the ship that you see here at the bottom right of the cover is actually the San Diego, which was an Atlanta class anti-aircraft cruiser. I think that's what they called it back then. The other one is the battleship Massachusetts. These were built at the Bethlehem Quincy shipyard in Fall River, Massachusetts. I just want to say something briefly about the title, Warship Builders. I wanted to make sure that people understood that this is not another story of Kaiser Shipbuilding in the Second World War. I think we've had plenty of those, starting, of course, with Frederick Lane's very important work on the Liberty ship construction in the Second World War. This is not it. This is an industrial history of U.S. naval shipbuilding, and I think that's very important to point out, because I think there are, of course, very important differences between naval construction and cargo ship construction. One of the most important of which, and that's a theme that I'm hammering away at in the book, is that you do not build naval vessels in mass production. What you really see happening for the most part in naval shipbuilding is what industrial historians call batch production, and that is usually production of items in very short runs, usually complex systems using significant inputs of skilled labor, of flexible production machinery, and those tend to be pretty design-intensive products. I mean, I'm kind of, approaching this really from the point of view of an industrial historian, and so for me, that's a very important part of the story, to say that when you are looking at naval shipbuilding, it's a whole different animal compared to merchant construction in the Kaiser shipyards. So that's one. The other one is, Hal, I think earlier pointed out that there are some projects that kind of run away from you, and this is definitely one. I had originally planned this as a follow-up volume to my first book on the Philadelphia Philadelphia shipbuilding industry from Civil War to 29, and that was going to be my original geographic focus. As I went into this project, I kept thinking, well, so what are they really doing up in Maine? What are they doing in Newport News? What are they doing in other places, right? So make a long story short, this turned into a national history, really, of U.S. naval shipbuilding with some comparisons of British, of German, and of Japanese shipbuilding during this very same time period as well. So yeah, it's a runaway project. I mean, it took me about 10 years to kind of eventually put this together in any event. So here's a quick table of contents. And, as I'm going through this, I'm just going to give you an overview of kind of some of the nuggets of information and some of the highlights in each chapter. I know that some of you have attended my previous talks, Evan did, and so, I don't want to kind of bore you with the strict repeat of what I did elsewhere. But in any event, this is kind of a broad overview with some highlights, really, of what is in some of the chapters. So the first one really deals with the decline of American shipbuilding after the Washington Naval Treaty. and of 1922. That's kind of the official beginning of the book. And then it moves into other areas. Let me see, where am I here? Yes, so this is actually the launching of Saratoga, the first one. That's this ex-Lexington class battle cruiser that got converted alongside with Lexington into aircraft carriers. And you see this here, that was built at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, which was actually not located in New York, but in Camden, New Jersey. One of the largest American shipbuilders of this period. What's important to notice about this picture is that the Saratoga was pretty much the only ship that was under construction here. This photograph, I want to say this was taken in about 1925, and it illustrates, well, certainly, a high point in the history of this particular shipyard, at the same time that you will notice that the slipways are empty. And that really encapsulates the crisis that this industry went through after the First World War. The book points out that there's a lot of overproduction going on really in the First World War of naval as well as merchant ships. So this industry is one in which the 1920s never ever roared. In fact, there's a number of yards that go out of business, like Torpedo does. And then in the Philadelphia area, right across the river from New York Ship, there was Cramp Shipbuilding, that had been really one of the leading yards. And it's one of the kind of cornerstones of my first book. But this is an organization that was in so many ways at the forefront of American shipbuilding for a long time. One of the few private shipyards that converted from wood to iron and later on steel construction. Cramp went out of business in 27. So this is in some respects really a harrowing economic story. Now, you see a little bit of a revival going on in shipbuilding in the 1930s under FDR. FDR, infamous for being a ship buff, right? I think, there's a story going around that FDR actually personally picked all the names of every naval ship that was commissioned during the interwar period. So, in any event, he ended up being really instrumental in including the shipbuilding industry and particularly naval construction in the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. That, for the most part, really had very little to do with anything defense or naval related, but it did fund the construction of $238 million worth of naval vessels, two of which we see here. That is at Newport News Shipbuilding down in Virginia. Let me see if we can sort of recognize that. That's of course Yorktown, and that is at the bottom right. And then in the dry dock, you see Enterprise kind of undergoing the finishing touches. Now, this is an interesting story. Why is it that Newport News ended up in carrier construction? As we saw just a minute ago, actually, it was New York Shipbuilding and Bethlehem Quincy that had prior experience in aircraft carrier construction. Now, make a long story short, there was a dirty deal that was done behind closed doors in a hotel in Washington, D.C., when all the naval shipbuilders got together in 1927, and they parceled out the naval construction contracts amongst themselves. Each and every one of them wanted to make sure that they were going to earn enough money out of each, and they did. They very much did. This is a scandal that was later on uncovered by the Nye Committee hearings, also known as the Merchant of Death hearings in 1935, in excruciating detail, the ways in which New York Ship, the Bethlehem, Quincy, and Newport News parceled out before they did the bidding, the construction of these ships. In any event, I mean, Newport News ended up pulling the trump card because they, of course, are still in business. The other two are not. The other two were going to do cruisers. That was the original agreement in 1927. They did cruisers, and cruisers eventually went on their way out. Aircraft carrier construction turned out to be significantly more profitable and had a far greater longevity than anything that the other two are involved in any event. So, this is kind of how this interwar period goes through the ups and downs in naval construction, particularly. There's a good chunk about the kind of corporate history of these organizations in there as well, their profitability, all of that. The next chapter, it's titled An Unending Effort to Satisfy the Needs for High Speed and Great Strength. And this is really more or less for connoisseurs of these things. What it really primarily deals with is the development during the interwar period of shipbuilding technology and of marine engineering technology as well. And the reason why this is important is one of the great innovations that took place during the interwar period is the introduction of electric arc welding. It's important for my money to document this because Heinrich Kaiser, the great magnate of Kaiser Shipbuilding during the Second World War, always claimed that it was he who introduced electric arc welding in the shipbuilding industry. That's not true. It was actually the Naval Shipbuilders who did this, with the strong encouragement of the U.S. Navy itself. The Navy in the 20s in particular, but also in the 30s, was trying to really pay a lot of attention to ship weight. And that is because the U.S. Navy had to, of course, conform to the naval treaties of Washington in 22 and London in 1930. And the Navy was therefore keenly interested in weight savings at all costs. And that is one of the reasons why the Navy was encouraging the shipbuilders to introduce this technique, basically because it saved weight across the hull, really, and the superstructure, interior, and everything else. What happens is that this technology, electric arc welding, gets introduced really piecemeal. During the Second World War, what starts to happen is that the Navy adopt kind of a hybrid system. You probably see this all around the Midway and any number of naval vessels that you see out of the Second World War, the Iowa class, where actually the bow and stern sections are usually welded, and the midship section is riveted. And that is a result really of design studies that were going on at the David Taylor Research Lab and other places, where it became clear that particularly amidships you needed greater strength, and that is why they kept the riveting in place. As far as the workforce training is concerned, that presented a difficult issue for most of the shipbuilders. Most of the shipbuilders that ended up attempting initially to retrain riveters to electric arc welding, that didn't go very well, because the riveters that had been working with pneumatic riveting guns usually did not have kind of the steady hand. When you're using a riveting gun, that delivers quick succession of blows on the rivet to hammer it flat, right? And this is a real physical challenge, as far as then these guys who did not have steady hands after working a couple of years with pneumatic riveting guns to go into welding, because welding, you need a very steady hand. So this is kind of a new technology, comes about in the 1930s, really, primarily as a result of the Navy's great interest in weight savings. And by the way, it's kind of an interesting way to connect the larger big picture history of the diplomatic agreements at Washington, as well as London in 1930, to this sort of minute technical history that is happening on the slipways. Now, there's other applications. You kind of see this here, the way in which electric arc welding was done on, I think this is the USS Washington, which was built at the Philadelphia Navy Yard starting in 1937. That's what it was laid down. And this is evidently as a result of or at a much later point in the construction process. So this is basically electric arc welding. Riveting did remain in place, as we said, and as far as the workplace skills were concerned, you kind of see these guys here squeezing themselves into very tight places. That caused a very serious discussion among naval architects and marine engineers, because there was recognition gradually that you had to design ships that could actually be built by guys who were in these tight spaces. And there's a pretty extensive conversation going on about these issues in the technical literature that proliferates in the 1930s to make designs that can actually be executed by people on the shop floor. Right. And evidently here that had not yet been the case. All right. The other kind of major introduction or major innovation that takes place between the wars, particularly in American shipyards, is the introduction of pre-assemblies. This is a picture from the war, from the construction of the second Princeton at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where you can see a pretty large workpiece being lifted into place on the slipways. Now, this is a technique that got introduced again during the interwar period, where very large sections of the hull in particular, but also of superstructures and tanks and things of that nature, took place inside the shop. And then these pieces were hauled, in this particular instance with the barge, next to the slipways, and were then lifted into place. Now, what you needed for that was extensive craneage. That is, ability to lift and lower these sections into place. And that was one of the things that American shipbuilders, particularly compared to the British, were very good at. You see this happening at the Navy Yards. You see this really across the board in private industry that is very keen on introducing heavy lifting equipment that is needed to pick up and lower these pre-assemblies into place on the slipways. That turned out to be a massive advantage during the Second World War because it speeded up the construction process. Usually slipways are bottlenecks in shipbuilding. You want to be able to shorten as much as possible the amount of time that you're assembling hulls. And the pre-assembly technique that was actually pioneered by New York Ship around the turn of the century, the pre-assembly techniques, they proliferate in the 1930s in particular, and make it possible for American shipyards to achieve these astounding output rates that we'll talk about a little bit later once we get to the stats. But again, I mean, this is a technique that comes into place to the credit, I think, of American naval architects and shipbuilders. In the United States, you have very limited to actually almost no modular construction that is going on. Modular construction in which entire sections were already fitted with electrical systems, with pipes, with pumps, all of this in the workshops, and then assembled on the slipways. Well, the Germans tried to do this. The Germans tried to introduce modular construction in the building of the Type 21 submarine. And it was an absolute disaster because the pipes wouldn't fit, the electrical wires wouldn't fit from section to section. The Americans were more conservative as far as pre-assembly techniques were concerned. Again, They basically built hollow sections and then assembled them on the slipways, and then they stretched the wires and installed the pipes. So that is one of the middle paths that American shipbuilders pursued during the interwar period and particularly during the Second World War. I think there's a clear recognition, really, of the technical limits of what you can do with precision engineering in the United States. The Germans were too arrogant about this. They thought they could make this work, and it turned out to be a disaster. I have actually in the book a pretty interesting conversation that was going on about the Type 21 submarine, where you have one of the old shipbuilders, guy by the name of Rudolf Blom, who was heavily critical of modular construction, said we can't make it work. We cannot make this work properly. It's not going to fit. He was then accused by sort of the guy who designed the Type 21 production system, guy by the name of Merker, of attempts to sabotage the German war effort, which is bizarre because Rudolf Blom was a hardcore Nazi. But in any event, the American shipbuilding industry did not embark wholesale on modular construction. And they didn't do that for a long time, actually. It was in Japan, post-war, really in the 1950s, modular construction was introduced by an ex-Kaiser shipbuilder at Ishikajima. And I think Newport News didn't really start doing this until the 60s and 70s, modular construction. So what we're talking about here is a relatively conservative approach to pre-assembly, and it worked. For the Americans, certainly it worked. Here's another one as far as the engineering is concerned, and that is turbines. Very much in contrast to the Liberty ships, which had reciprocating engines. Basically, this is 19th century technology. Of course, naval vessels had high-speed turbines and were powered by high-speed turbines. This is, again, a technology. In this particular instance, it did come initially from the electrical industry because turbine systems were introduced by General Electric and Westinghouse, really for hydroelectric dams that proliferated in the 1920s. And the Navy then piggybacked onto this as far as the design is concerned. There was a GE Curtiss a turbine design that turned out to be very effective, and that is what powered most American naval vessels during the interwar period and during the war. There's a huge row that took place in the 1930s. The Navy was keenly interested in introducing high pressure and high temperature boiler steam. The shipbuilders themselves didn't like that. They preferred really the old-fashioned Parsons turbine system, and there was a great deal of resistance actually against the introduction of the high pressure, high temperature turbines that I'm trying to document in this book. Again, I mean, this is really for connoisseurs of these things who are interested. Now, as far as turbines is concerned, turbines usually, marine turbines, they run most effectively in big ships at about 5,000 RPM. That's way too fast to put on a propeller. And so what you had to do was turn the 5,000 RPM in, for instance, an Iowa class battleship into 202 RPM. This was done with the technology, again, that the Americans were very good at, and that is the double reduction gear. This is a technology that comes, again, out of the interwar period. These were mechanisms that were precision engineered. When you talk about the gear cutting that was done on these things, this was produced in a temperature-controlled environment where the temperature was held at 67 degrees Fahrenheit for about 17 days. You couldn't stop the grinder. You had to keep grinding this thing. You're talking about kind of, a 200-inch diameter wheel that had to be machined to the thickness of cigarette paper. That's what it was really all about. And of course, you did need advanced workplace skills, and you needed very much advanced production capabilities to achieve these records. Again, the Americans were very good at this. One of the reasons is because the Americans were gearing up for a Pacific War. And as it turns out, these new turbine systems, and especially double reduction gear, it also saves you a lot of fuel. And the American standard, pretty much, or rule of thumb, is really they wanted to have, for the Pacific War, an operational range of about 10,000 miles. And because of the Washington Naval Treaty, the Americans didn't have refueling stations west of Hawaii. That was different for the British. The British did have at Singapore a pretty substantial refueling station. And that is one of the reasons why they didn't pay so much attention to fuel savings that came out of this system. As it turns out, this was far more reliable. It was, again, fuel efficient, and it accounts for the ability of the U.S. Navy in the Second World War to conduct long-range operations. The British had, again, issues with that, primarily because they thought, it doesn't really matter that much to have significant range capability, because they thought they were going to operate pretty close to their bases. As it turned out, when King George V, when that battleship went hunting after Bismarck, they had to turn around in the very end stage of that battle, among other reasons, because they were running on fumes, and that is one of the reasons why King George V, the battleship, had to turn around and leave the sinking of the Bismarck to Rodney and to the destroyers. In any event, so this kind of gives you a sense of some of the advantages that the Americans did possess in terms of naval engineering and marine engineering. So coming to the next chapter, it really talks about the grand scheme of things, the naval strategy, shipbuilding programs, and Navy Department reforms from 40 to 45. What it does talk about is primarily Roosevelt's, and this takes us back to this picture. That takes us back to Roosevelt's attempt to institute naval rearmament on a very significant scale across the board, and starting in 1940, and that was really key. This kind of strategically comes after the fall of France. Everybody and their cousin had expected the French army to hold back the Germans. Turned out not to be the case. The Germans did take control then of the French Atlantic coast. They already had Norway, and used that for submarine bases, of course, and for forward deployments. And that is what really sent shock waves through the British and the Americans in June and July 1940. The American strategic planners, they recognize that they have a real problem on their hands. There are predictions really in 1940, in the summer of 1940, that eventually Operation Sea Lion will succeed, and that Britain is going to get knocked out of the war, and that, as a matter of fact, then the United States would have to confront the Axis powers, and that did include Japan with a very significant Navy, as well as the Italians and the Germans, that the United States would have to confront the Axis powers by itself. And that is what's kind of behind the buildup of the U.S. Navy that then started in 1940. That is when most of the kind of appropriations were made on the part of Congress. Carl Vinson played a very important part in this. Carl Vinson, the congressman from Georgia, I think, excuse me, one of the few individuals who had an aircraft carrier named after them, except except presidents. So Carl Vinson was the guiding force really behind putting the enabling legislation and the funding through Congress in the summer of 1940, really worked hand in glove with Admiral Stark and others in the U.S. Navy who testified in front of his committee on behalf of the construction of what was at the time and then later on called a two-ocean navy, that would be able to fight in the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. Right? And that is what's behind the two-ocean navy program that then got implemented with significant speed, really, in 1940 and following. When you kind of look at American naval shipbuilding, there was other legislation, and it is in the book, but the big one is really the Two-Ocean Navy Act. That is, the implementation of that was really what the American naval shipbuilders had to do post-1940. There was some criticism, actually, of this program. There were kind of 2020 hindsight. A lot of people said, we're really putting way too much emphasis on heavy surface forces like the Massachusetts, like the San Diego, other ships, by the way, as well as aircraft carriers, and that we're really not paying sufficient attention to anti-submarine warfare. And there's an extensive debate that went on in 1940 about the extent to which we should include anti-submarine warfare forces, in these enormous naval appropriations. Well, and I've had conversations with people and disagreements about this whole idea, where, I said basically that the British were significantly ahead of the Americans in conceptualizing convoy warfare and anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, and that the Americans were stragglers. I think on behalf of the U.S. naval establishment, and particularly Admiral Ernest King, whom I'm usually not a friend of, but I think it's important to kind of emphasize that when the Two-Ocean Navy was put together in 1940, conceptually, that the premier threat to North Atlantic shipping really came from surface raiders. And, and there was a whole bunch. There was Admiral Scheer, there was Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, there was very famously then Bismarck and Prinz Eugen, right, in 1941. But that is kind of the basic idea that surface raiders in 1940 presented a significant threat to merchant shipping, and that U-boats were a little bit on the margins still. That, of course, changed, and the Germans did put literally all their money into submarine construction. The German surface fleet got emasculated. A lot of this stuff wasn't even built. H-class battleships, aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin that got laid down and then postponed and restarted and all of this, but it still wasn't done by the end of the war. So the Germans really switched the name of the game with the emphasis on submarine construction, and it was really difficult to foresee that in 1940 when the U.S. Navy started to strategize the war in the Atlantic and place primary emphasis really on surface units. So that is kind of one of the themes in that chapter. The chapter also talks about the kind of very important administrative reforms that went on in the Navy Department. There's the merger of the Bureau of Engineering on the one hand and the Bureau of Construction and Repair on the other hand into the Bureau of Ships. That was actually a very smart move, and because it did integrate naval architecture and marine engineering to a very significant degree, and it worked out well. It worked out extremely well, I think, for the American war effort. By the way, the Bureau of Ordnance was not included in that merger, to the later regret of these reformers, because the Bureau of Ordnance oftentimes did not coordinate very well with the Bureau of Ships. And make a long story short, as it turned out, the main turrets of the Iowa class had a diameter that was, according to the initial drawings by the Bureau of Ordnance, 2 feet too large to fit into that hull. And so there was a lot of re-engineering that had to, and corrections that needed to go on. But it's an example for the significance and importance, really, of administrative reforms and an effective procurement apparatus. Chapter, where are we? We are in chapter 4, and that's an important story as far as I'm concerned, and that is the buildup of U.S. naval shipyard capabilities, or as they were known up until 1945, Navy Yards. And the key aspect of this is that Navy Yards were actually far better equipped, really, for shipbuilding than any other private yards. Everybody was complaining in the 30s there's not enough money appropriated for the Navy, but the Navy got more money for new welding systems, electric arc welding systems, for cranes, for all kinds of things in the 1930s that the private shipbuilding industry lacked. And as a result of that, the Navy Yards, government-owned and operated Navy Yards, that's the important part, were far better equipped, really, for naval construction in the Second World War than the others. Here, I did want to share some of the construction records of the leading ones, and here you have Philadelphia, there's Brooklyn and Boston, and the rest of them as well. And the book does talk about all of these quite a bit. There's kind of case studies in the book. As far as Brooklyn is concerned, the Brooklyn Navy Yard was earmarked really in 1938 as what they called a battleship yard, and it was already at that time busy with the construction of the North Carolina class, which was also incidentally designed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, as was Iowa and the whole Iowa class. Philadelphia turned out to be an extremely diverse industrial environment where they built not only aircraft carriers and battleships like they did in Brooklyn, but a whole range of other things as well. Light cruisers, heavy cruisers, landing ships. These were very, very complex organizations. And again, I mean, the book kind of goes into really these various administrative aspects. How were the Navy Yards run? What were some of the problems? What were some of the opportunities? I can say that one of the problems is that in the Navy Yards is, and I'm probably, not talking to the right people about this, but the Navy Yards had not enough civilians and too many military officers in charge of production, and that was really key. There's a lot of manpower studies that were done during the war in which this was regarded as a very serious deficiency, because basically naval officers were not sufficiently trained in industrial practices, industrial management to handle naval shipbuilding effectively. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages. As far as the advantages, again, I mean, we talked about the ways in which the Navy Yards were far better equipped as a result of smarter investment strategies on the part of the Navy before 1940. Okay, so here's Brooklyn. That's the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and at the center you see Missouri outfitting. At the bottom there, I think that's Bennington. That is one of the Essex-class aircraft carriers that were built during the war, putting the finishing touches on that. And so this is an enormous industrial facility. I want to say they employed about 50,000 people during the war. And there was a lot of training going on in the shipyard to get new recruits into the shipbuilding trades, including, yes, that's an important photo here, from the National Youth Administration. This is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and this is a young trainee who's learning electric arc welding. And a lot of people kind of call electric arc welding an unskilled trade. And anybody who says that, I always tell them, do that. Do it. Just do a little bit of electric arc welding, and then talk to me afterwards about that. This is an unskilled trade. Try it. You got to learn how to do it. You got to learn how to do it right, and especially in naval vessels. You see this here. There's a lot of complex equipment where you're controlling the amperage. You got to have a steady hand. You got to deposit enough material, not too much, and the weld seam, all of that stuff. And again, I mean, this is a trade that you need to learn, and you need to learn how to do it well. There's kind of crazy anecdotes that I dug up about some welding failures during the Second World War. The Iowa, when that keel, portions of that keel were welded. Well, when you distribute welding of various sections over an 800-foot distance, you get a phenomenon that's called weld shrinkage. And the keel of the Iowa was actually bent slightly to starboard. They realized that a little bit later, and they had to take the whole thing apart and do it over again. So that is one example for, well, it was a good thing that these young guys were trained well in the key shipyard trades. Another aspect of this is race relations, which were bad in Brooklyn. They were terrible, really. Except, there's a few instances, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard is one of them. There was little formal race discrimination going on in the hiring. The workshop culture is a whole different story, but there's a very famous historian by the name of Howard Zinn. Maybe some of you have heard about him. He wrote The People's History of the United States, was a famous civil rights activist throughout his life, later on professor at Boston University. He got hired during this period. He was 18, kid out of Brooklyn. He got hired out of 30,000 applicants. He was one of the 400 that got picked, and ended up becoming a shipfitter and learned the various components. Now, he did deposit an oral history at the Brooklyn Historical Society, where he talked about some of the aspects, some of the more critical and racial aspects, really, of relations in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So lastly, I want to talk about the government pays for everything in their private builders and contractor-operated yards. This is very important, I think, for our understanding, not just of naval shipbuilding in the Second World War, but really military contracting throughout this period. And you kind of get a sense of, this stupendous amount of money of government direct Navy investments that went into the private shipyards. There's four actually. Cramp got revived during the Second World War. Again, story is in the book. But the four biggest shipyards each got $20 million. That's real money. That's real money. They got new slipways, they got new cranes, welding equipment, machine tools, anything. And the Navy paid for it. And these are direct Navy investments. And the private shipbuilders were quite happy with this. Long-term effects of this is, a little bit questionable. Right now, I'm doing the Cold War shipbuilding industry, and American builders were actually quite happy to rest on their laurels during the 1950s, because they really didn't update their facilities after having been showered with money by the U.S. Navy. In any event, so there's a lot of money that went into this. Here's one of the things in the book. That is the layout of New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey, and the dark ones, the dark shaded areas. Those are all facilities that were added at Navy expense in the Second World War. Well, and maybe some of you are familiar with this particular photograph because that is the Midway. That is the Midway under construction, putting the finishing touches on it at Newport News Shipbuilding. The Midway class really has an interesting story behind it. There were some people who greatly favored it, of course, in terms of the ability to build, to construct, design, and construct a follow-up to the Essex class, right? And the Navy, some people in the Navy was greatly in favor of this big attack aircraft carrier. There were other people who were not very happy about this, including Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said, before you finish these ships, this war is going to be over. And that was correct. It turned out that the Midway class, all of the 3 Midway class carriers, all 3 of them were commissioned after the war was over. So FDR turned out to be correct. Interestingly enough, one of the Midway class was in fact named after him, right? Harry Truman, who took that decision, was probably not aware of the controversy that went on behind the scenes. I want to end with this, and this is gives you a sense of the enormous production capabilities that went into the building of the U.S. Navy during the Second World War. Make a long story short, they really left the British, the Japanese, and the Germans far behind, really, in every vessel class. And this is basically the Navy that fought in the later stages of the war, in the Philippines, Leyte Gulf, all of these places, and that then created kind of the basis really of the early Cold War Navy. So I want to leave it there. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, I see a couple of hands up. So let me get out of here. I'm going to stop sharing this and invite questions, comments, thoughts, criticisms.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I'm gonna jump in first, just because I can. I really liked. I read your book, and I was really impressed by some of the new things I learned. And for example, it's always struck me how U.S. warships got so much better gas mileage, fuel mileage, if you will, than non-U.S. ships, just across the board. And your explanation of the double reduction gearing, for example, is something which kind of put all these little light bulbs going off in my head. So, I appreciate stuff like that. I mean, who likes Kaiser? Kaiser kind of built a narrative about what happened during World War II. And I appreciate the way that Kaiser, gave health benefits to his employees, this, that, and the other. But let's face it, there was a lot more going on there. So I think you bring a little bit of a corrective to that, and I appreciate it. And the last comment I'm going to make, which for me is my most important comment, was kind of illustrated by your last slide. Where's Italy? There were how many nations in the world that could build a battleship in 1940? I think 7, maybe if you include the Dutch, maybe 8. The Dutch probably could have done it if they wanted to. Right. And I think that's a topic that really needs to be explored. Is worldwide shipbuilding in let's say in the interwar period, and the slipways that were available to the different nations. You speak about Germany a little bit in your book. You speak about the British a little bit, and how can you not? And the Japanese, of course. But the picture's a little bit larger, and the whole ability to build a major warship was one that was pretty rare. And the way that the different nations approach that topic, industrial practices, is very important. I think your point about the Germans and prefabrication is wonderful. And so, unfortunately, you're already into the Cold War. But if you weren't, I would have strongly encouraged you to.
I know. Well, here's the thing. Make a long story short, I do speak German. With a name like Heinrich, you do, but I mean, I'm sort of a primary source freak. I love the archives, and I have virtually no Italian, and my French is awful. So that's kind of my cheap explanation. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm looking forward to working with people who have expertise in those areas. Yeah. Valid criticism. I take it.
Well, it's not criticism. It's just a point.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. I'll surrender the floor.
Yeah, I think Hal, I think you had your hand up. I'll call on people. Okay.
I was intrigued that the Saratoga was built in a shed, and like the Yamato and Musashi. And so, I mean, we know why the Japanese did that. Did American naval shipbuilders very often build in sheds?
No, they didn't. They didn't. New York Ship was actually the only big one that did.
Okay.
And this really goes back to the turn of the century. And the guy who introduced the prefabrication system, Henry Morse, was very much enamored with the idea of covered slipways. And
Okay.
and so, he's the one that introduced it. Nobody really copied it. The British were thinking about it in the Second World War, and especially after the introduction of electric arc welding, they said, it always rains in Scotland, and that's why we should have covered slipways. But at that point, it was too late.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I speak?
Yeah, absolutely, Heaven. Yeah.
Can I say it doesn't always rain in Scotland? That's an unfair statement about Scotland. But more seriously, I mean, I thought a great talk, and I really enjoyed the book very much. The one question I had lots of questions, but the one major question I had, which I thought could have been covered more in the book, was the acceleration of the carrier program between 1940 and 1943. And one question is, I suppose it's probably true that the Essex class came on stream a year earlier than they were programmed to, and I wondered why that happened.
Yeah.
And the second question is about the Independence class. Was that really Roosevelt's idea? I mean, he pushed it through, and it's something which the Navy didn't like originally, and I know Friedman argues that. Yes. But those two programs are critical to the American success in the Pacific War, and I wondered if you could just shed a bit more light on them.
Absolutely. Yes, and I mean, I took it from Friedman as well. The notion that FDR was the one that was pushing for it. The Navy was not very happy with the Independence class aircraft carriers by a long shot. And King, I think, thought it was a waste of time and money. But I think kind of it turns out, I mean, they did not convert these Cleveland class cruisers into carriers as quickly as they hoped they would be able to do it. But I remember, I mean, they do show up. Task Force 58, they're there, and they've fought a number of hard battles, right? Yeah. So the acceleration of the program, basically, this involves a reallocation of resources that is starting to take place, moving away from battleships. The Montana class got canceled. It got scaled back and eventually canceled. That freed up some significant steel production capabilities that you could put into the carriers, and it also turned out that Newport News shipbuilding benefited a great deal from specialization in carriers. That was one of their big advantages. It's one of the advantages that did come out of this shady deal that we saw in the 20s and 30s of specialization in this particular vessel type. And building an aircraft carrier is a tall order. It really is at every corner, right? In the design process, I mean, there's things that need to be done to carriers in terms of gasoline storage, in terms of launch capabilities, elevators to get these planes, on the deck, all of this stuff. And Newport News benefited really from the specialization in this line of business. They were able really to do a lot of that design work in-house. They left the cruiser design really to New York Ship, and in the end, that paid off. It really did pay off very significantly.
Thanks. That's great.
Was there another question? Did I miss something, Evan?
Well, if you, yeah, well, another question would be, why did they build so many Cleveland class? I mean, why was that a huge program?
Yeah, well, for the cruiser offensive, really in the Pacific, right? I mean, they also thought, that they really needed stuff to deal with the Mogami and the Japanese cruisers. They really thought that this was a real a challenge at all levels. I think the Americans didn't realize how poorly designed and how poorly protected the Mogami class cruisers were. But I think there was a great deal of concern that went into that, and well, I mean, it paid off during the Solomons, right? I mean, to put serious money into cruisers. Yeah. So then, I mean, it turns into this split program really at New York Ship, where they build half of these as carriers and the other half as cruisers. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a question about all the little anti-submarine ships that we haven't kind of addressed, but they were a huge portion of fixing the war toward 42, 43.
Yes, and that's an important story. It involves primarily the Portsmouth Navy Yard, which did a lot of the design work. They had a design activity really dating back to the 1930s. And then it involves Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. By the way, another shipyard that benefited hugely from Navy investments. They built the Victory Yard pretty much from scratch at Navy expense, and that is what made it possible to put together this vast American submarine force that then fought, for the most part, really in the Pacific, and did so successfully once they had sorted out their torpedo problems. That plagued what was it, the Mark 14? I can't remember, but in any event, something along those lines. So. The American submarine offensive, that turned out to be very successful because the Japanese didn't put any capabilities and money into anti-submarine warfare. Right? I mean, and you sort of saw what the Americans, the British, Canadians were doing in the Atlantic. That was the scale that you needed in order to deal with subs. And, and not little projects here and there. The Japanese learned this way too late because they basically banked on one Trafalgar style victory that would settle things, and we're not prepared for a long war, certainly not for submarine warfare.
Professor?
Yeah.
Yes. Did you encounter much material on the other part of fleet expansion, recommissionings and acquired vessels, such as the four stackers and the early troop transports that used to be passenger liners?
There was some of that. There's a very extensive conversation that is going on in the U.S. Navy about conversions, even passenger ship conversions. The America, the Navy was talking, that's a passenger liner that also got built in Newport News, where they are thinking about the possibility of having to deal with, a full-fledged conversion of a passenger ship. The Japanese did that, the Americans didn't, which was probably wise. You don't want to send a thin-hulled ex-passenger ship into naval warfare, right? As far as conversions, well, I mean, there were the Fletchers, the four stackers, right? That come out of the First World War, that got tucked away in the reserve basin, primarily in Philadelphia, and there's an awful lot of recommissioning of that going on, starting really in 1940 after Roosevelt signed that destroyer for basis deal, and transferred the four stackers to Britain. I think all 50 of them. So there's that. A lot of recommissioning. The Navy, I think, recognized that there was kind of limited viability, technological viability, really, of these ships, of the older ships. At one point they talked about Utah. We looked at Pearl Harbor, but Utah, which had actually been disarmed after the Washington Naval Treaty. The Navy is thinking about maybe refurbishing that and putting the guns back in. They didn't. They recognized that naval technology had really had really outpaced the state of the art of 1913, and including, by the way, the Arizona.
Did you see much discussion on those controversial Alaska-class large cruisers?
Yeah, I saw a lot of that discussion that did not end up in the book. Alaska class, that was another sort of FDR project. He loved these things. These were very large cruisers, and he wanted to have 6 of those built. They were included in the 1942 Ocean Navy Act. Eventually, there were engineering problems up the wazoo. The protection was no good. So New York Ship finished 3 of those. The rest got sort of tossed. The contracts were, and so these were these ghost ships that were still floating around. Right? I mean, literally, and that is after the war. And there's all kinds of conversion, into missile cruisers and all of that. And, but finally they scrapped them. They were no good and of no use.
Professor?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ralph Norton here. I'm probably one of the few non-historians here. Just to let you know my background. I'm an engineer who's worked in oil refinery construction and commissioning for 40 years. That thing about small spaces, they still make that mistake. A 4-foot 10-inch welder's in great demand. But basic question too, problem we've had over the last 40 years is the quality control of American steel. The precision with which they make their alloys is terrible compared to Japan, Germany, Italy, Spain. Spain makes really great steel.
Yes.
Was that a problem in the time period we're talking about here as well?
Quality control. Yes, it was an issue. It was a serious issue in the steel industry. U.S. Steel had to put up with a lot of Navy inspections, which was a good thing because some of the steel was substandard. And it was a good thing that it did not end up in the battleships and the carriers and cruisers and subs, especially subs. But that continues after the war, as far as quality control problems are concerned. Steel industry, what is that? The HY80/100 steel, right? That they started using in submarine construction. There's endless problems with this from a production standpoint, and they needed to be far greater quality control. They really should have bought some of their steel in Czechoslovakia, quite frankly, like the British, as a matter of fact, did.
There's many American refiner that specifies their steel for new equipment has to be outsourced to certain countries overseas. Period. Will not accept American steel.
That's right. Yeah, the steel industry has a terrible record, really, in quality control, and I mean the shipbuilders hated this. There's problems. It turns out that a lot of these plates could not be welded because the carbon content was too high, too low, all of that. And again, I mean, it is a very serious problem, and especially if you're dealing with organizations that hadn't worked for the Navy before. The Navy wants top-notch stuff, and it has some of the most stringent quality standards really anywhere in industry. And then you get these new mills that come online, and they don't know what they're doing, right? And that is a very serious problem that confronted the builders that had to, that you had to scrap the plates in many instances because they turned out to be not weldable. Yeah.
Well, that problem continues till today. Thank you.
It does. Thank you. Very important insight. Yes. Yep. All right.
Okay. Any other questions or observations for the professor?
Yes, Don Patton. I am not a naval historian. I'm not familiar with the book, but in the presentation, you didn't mention any of the Gulf shipbuilding. They were probably smaller. I know my father actually worked in the Orange, Texas. I had an uncle that worked in the Beaumont, Texas shipyards.
Yeah. Those were what you could call greenfield yards that were built during the war for the most part. And Orange, Texas is one example for that. There were others. One was in Newark, New Jersey. And Gulf shipbuilding, I mean, that really comes into play much more during the Cold War. Lytton, Avondale, those ones. And for the war period, there was Alabama Shipbuilding. But, you know, the Navy didn't really trust these people in terms of, again, quality control, right? I mean, you know, if you build oil tanks for a while, that does not necessarily teach you much about very advanced naval shipbuilding skills, you know? And so a lot of these guys, a lot of the Gulf builders that came online really after the war. That's when, and they got what the Navy called education orders to kind of get them started small on landing craft, and then they could work their way up into destroyers and subs and so forth. Yeah.
Can you point me to a source about the orange?
Yes.
I'll get your email and
if you would get my email, have a look. Yes. You know, I'll follow up on that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I know currently there's actually, I think Mississippi now has a major shipbuilding.
That's right, Pascagoula.
Did that originate in World War II?
Yes, it did. I mean, this got a real massive makeover during this 1960s. Yeah. All right.
Okay, anything else? Well, thank you very much, Professor Heinrich. I'm definitely including your book in my personal library. I'm doing these courses for my own work. And we appreciate your having basically laid the template for what an Author's Corner presentation should be.
Thank you. Appreciate it.